So the church is composed of bishops, priests, and deacons. The bishops are the direct successors of the apostles. Every single one of the bishops can trace his ordainer back to someone who was ordained by someone that was ordained by someone that was ordained by one of the apostles at the end of the day. And we see specific guidelines and criteria for the early church and how they chose the bishops. The exact specifications of how you choose a bishop don't really matter. They cast lots to choose Matthias. The church could choose lots to this day. It's a very Jewish thing to do. If you read the Old Testament, you'll see that the priests in the temple would have in their vestments, they had basically dice, the Urim and the Thummim. And whenever they firmly believe that to paraphrase Einstein, God does not play dice with the universe, but God, who is in control of all things, could speak through what would appear to be otherwise random chance. So if they ever came to an issue where they couldn't decide, they would cast lots in order to figure out what they were going to do. It was a very Hebrew concept. So they can't figure out who it's going to be, whether this guy named Eustace, who's got like 5 names, or this guy named Matthias. But they cast lots and it falls to Matthias. We also see 2 other classes of ordained individuals. One of them are called the presbyteroi, or the priests. The word priest in English is literally just an Old English contraction of the word presbyteroi. And the priests are the helpers of the bishops. They take care of a lot of the sacramental day-to-day life. So, and then we have the deacons. The deacons are the helpers. The deacons are first ordained in Acts 6. One of the very first deacons is Stephen, the very first martyr for the church, who was stoned to death by the Jews that didn't like him, blaspheming about this Jesus fellow. And so we can see these divisions here even today. We have a bishop here in the archbishop. The archbishop is our archbishop here in Kansas City, Kansas. We're in his diocese. And so we have an archbishop. We have a bishop. And in fact, the only reason he's called an archbishop is there's actually 4 bishops in Kansas, and one of them just gets elevated so that if there's ever a question of what's happening, that's the one you go to. He's the archbishop. So our bishop is the archbishop of all of the Kansas territories. But there's 4 bishops. Our bishop, his name is Joseph Naumann right now. Before him, it was Patrick, I think, Kelleher. And we've had a number before that. This is actually the year that Archbishop Naumann will be stepping down, or at least bishops are supposed to tender their resignation to the Pope when they hit 75. He turned 75 this year. So we may have a new bishop by the end of this year, or the end of. I haven't actually heard what's going to happen then. Sometimes the Pope will be like, you're fine, just keep serving. That's what we all hope will happen with Archbishop Naumann. Is wonderful. But so you have your bishops, and your bishops are over a giant territory. It's called a diocese. And the reason it's called a diocese is the early Christians were persecuted. They were martyred for their faith. And one of the worst emperors out there was a guy named Diocletian. Diocletian was one of the first emperors that really systematized the attempts to exterminate the Christians. But he was a smart ruler in a lot of ways. And he divided up the territory of Rome, the whole Roman province, into chunks or sections. And because it was his decision to do it, they bear his name, so they were called dioceses. And what ironically wound up happening in the early church was there were bishops that were conglomerating together in certain places, and they said, well, you know what? There's this division of the empire already happening. And that seems like a really sound way for us to make sure there's a bishop in a pretty reasonable spot here and here and here and here and here to help kind of guide the church as it goes. And so you wound up having a bishop in each diocese. Now, what's really interesting is, slight backstory. The Jews, as they entered into the promised land, were told that God was giving them a land they did not build, fields they did not plant, if they were faithful to him. And their faithfulness was their faithfulness in battle. And he does the same thing with his church, with one exception. It was Tertullian, an early church father, writing around the end of the 200s, who said the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church. And the church was willing to suffer and raised not a sword, put up not a fight, and yet took over the largest empire the world has ever known. And it did it in part because as Vandals and Visigoths were raiding the coffers of the big cities, particularly Rome, the rich nobility fled the cities, kept to the old ways, and they lived in the peripheries of these cities. The word would be the pagans the outskirts, the rural areas. They were the bumpkins, more or less, the country bumpkins. So really the word pagan means bumpkin. But that's where the people that kept to the old ways and the old gods, Zeus and Jupiter and whatnot, would have lived. Meanwhile, there was a vacuum of authority and power in the cities, and those bishops who were already in the diocese stepped in and just brought order so that chaos wouldn't rain down on the people. And then about 100 years or so after this had happened, a guy named Constantine says, you know what, the empire is teetering and it looks like it's going to fall if we're not careful, but there's these guys that are already doing so much to keep the peace. I'm going to make sure they're okay. And so it was Constantine in 317 that passed the Edict of Nantes, which didn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome or anything, but basically decriminalized Christianity. And so simply through obedience to the faith, Christ was able to give his church the single greatest empire that the world has ever seen. I've always found that fascinating because it really does correspond with what he said and did in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament with his people. But anyway, so you have these bishops in these dioceses, and then the dioceses are usually broken up into parishes. We are here at St. Benedict's Catholic Parish. We have our own priest right now. Our priest is Father Luke. Right before him, it was Father Jeremy. He was here for 9 years, something like that. Before him, it was Father Luke was for but I think it was Father Gabriel. Before him, it was Father Gerard. It goes back. And so there's always a priest over a particular parish. And then many parishes will have helpers, which the Greek word diakonoi just means helper. So we'll have deacons. Now, this parish is weird. We have so many deacons for being such a small parish. We are lousy with deacons. We have at least 4 right now. Plus, there's one attached to the college. Deacon.
That's Sluter.
No, Sluter's the bald guy. I only can't think of his name because I'm trying right now. I could picture him. He always wears like a sweater vest. It's going to bug me. Anyway, we have at least 2 more coming in, too. And we had Deacon Philip Gilbert, who was actually an Eastern Rite Catholic, a Ukrainian Catholic who lived here for a long time. He actually finally got ordained as father deacon and is now living in Cody, Wyoming, as a priest up there in that diocese. So,
and he's married.
And he's married. So, and there are married priests in the Catholic Church, by the way. We'll talk about that down the road. But people always ask that question. It does happen. It's rare, but it does happen. He's one of them. Thus, having gone through all of that, and I'm sorry for these sides, but I like to just paint as much of a picture as I can when I'm doing this. Jesus' church has a hierarchy. And it's right there in the pages of Scripture. Paul writes about it explicitly. It's referenced in James. It's referenced in the Scriptures. Bishops and priests and deacons, and all of them can trace their lineage back to Peter and the apostles.
Can I
Yes, sir.
go back and ask you a question?
Please
So Peter was appointed as the successor to Judas, or to the office of Judas?
No, a man named, I don't remember, did I even finish it? There's a man named Matthias. If we read, this is in Acts chapter 1.
What I was actually going to ask is, so what was the office of Judas, or was he
one of the apostles?
Just one of the apostles, so they were
Yep.
adding a different one into 12?
Yep.
And
So an office always outlasts the office holder under normal circumstances. If I'm a CEO of a company, I might step down. But the company persists unless I was a terrible CEO. The presidency, it's up for grabs this year, right? It's an office. And probably one of 2 people will occupy it. I'm not going to get into politics in this class. But regardless of who goes into it, assuming they're not a terrible president and, wreak havoc on the whole country, and I know that people are getting politically charged, so again, I'm not going to get into politics about whichever side you feel about. Nevertheless, the position of the president outlasts any particular office holder from George Washington all the way down to the current occupant, Joseph Biden. So offices always outlast the office holders. And so the important thing to note there is Peter stands up and he says, hey, there's an office here. That office needs someone to be in it because the previous occupant is no longer able to fulfill his duties, given that he went and killed himself after betraying Jesus.